Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly journey into the ideas, people, and projects building the new digital economy and the future of money. We close out our first August here at LTB with an episode bursting at the seams. This week saw a flurry of news excitedly claiming disaster or deliverance from a set of meetings the Bitcoin Foundation undertook in the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. Bitcoin NYC's Jonathan Mohan sat down with Marco Santori, head of the Foundation's Legal Affairs Committee and one of the primaries at this week's meetings in question, to figure out what went on and if it's something the average user should worry about. Bitcoin, Litecoin, Barbecue Coin, Mastercoin, one of these things is not like the other. And towards the end of today's show, I speak with J.R. Willits, who is at the end of a successful crowdfunding launch, about what that means and why everyone should be excited about his new payment layer called Mastercoin. Throughout the show, I'm joined by Stephanie and Andreas for a variety of discussions, from the potential for Bitcoin exchanges on American Indian reservations to the TerraCoin time warp attempt and what can be learned from it. And finally, about physical Bitcoins and their unique proposition to trade digital advantages and hurdles for their physical equivalents. Enjoy the show and make sure to check out the new letstalkbitcoin.com. In the last few days, Jeff Fong took a look at denationalizing money with Bitcoin in Hayek to Satoshi and beyond. Tor Demister shared his journey from cautious interest to mining magnate with an insider's take on Bitcoin mining. And Invictus Innovations co-founder Daniel Larimer talked about improving what Bitcoin started to take back not just financial control, but communication and identity too. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. As usual, we're joined by the other hosts of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in secure systems and decentralized networks.
Kalimera.
Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host. Andreas, what did you even say?
I said Kalimera, which means good morning in Greek.
No. In addition, Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
How can I beat that? Hi.
Well, that works good. Speak your native language. Today, we're going to jump right into an interesting discussion topic submitted through the Let's Talk Bitcoin subreddit that you can visit by going to letstalkbitcoin.com/talk. This one is entitled Bitcoin on American Indian Reservations. I was listening to a non-Bitcoin related podcast, says Thomas533, where they were talking about the possibility of avoiding U.S. federal regulations by partnering with American Indian tribes because they have tribal sovereignty. It occurred to me that this would also be a great place for Bitcoin too. A quick Google search didn't turn up any discussions on this, so has the idea been thought of already? The Bush II administration clarified that, quote, limitations on tribal powers of self-government are few and include the same limitations applicable to states. For example, neither tribes nor states have the power to make war, engage in foreign relations, or coin money. And this is important, the coin money part. This does not seem to imply that they must take US dollars as their default currency. In fact, the late Russell Means of the Republic of Lakota had proposed the nation not use fiat currency, but instead adopt a gold standard. Would they be interested in using Bitcoins? This is a really interesting use scenario, I think, because they're right. You know, in a lot of places, there are de facto monies. You know, in most parts of the world, the local currency is the de facto money. But because there are these nations within nations, they don't necessarily have those same rules applied to them. So what do you guys think about this as it relates to Bitcoin?
I think it's a really interesting idea. I'd like it if everybody were just, free to use Bitcoin completely freely. I can see why people feel like this appeals to them, though, trying to partner up with Native American tribes. And actually, historically, there was the Lakota Nation, and they had the Free Lakota Bank where they were minting silver and stuff like that. Probably didn't care too much about those rules that said, you can't make coins or whatever. And they also tried to secede like about 1 million times, and they did secede about 1 million times. It's just, I don't know if the U.S. government recognized it. So there's been a huge movement for Native American sovereignty that's gone on for quite a while. And it's interesting. I was just on a road trip and I went through upstate New York, and there was the Six Nations, Oneida Six Nations, where there are several, Native tribes that have federally recognized sovereignty, and they've got some land that they have, and cops don't go in there. They kind of like turn around at the boundary. You don't have to show a passport or any documents to go in there, which is pretty cool. I like that. You can go in and sit down at a casino or in a restaurant, and it has smoking section and non-smoking section, which you wouldn't find in the US. And not that that's exactly like the freedom that I really want to have. I'm not a smoker or anything, but just made it obvious that you're not in Kansas anymore, right? You're in a different place. Yeah, I mean, like Bitcoins, sure, that could be a natural fit. The thing that I would really like to see more than that, though, is for people to not have to necessarily go into a Native American reservation or whatever to be able to use Bitcoins. I'd like to just see complete freedom of Bitcoin use everywhere.
I don't necessarily know if we're talking about needing to go into a reservation in order to use Bitcoin. I think this is more like if you had, say, an exchange that was based out of, one of these reservations, then they don't necessarily have the same sort of rules because it's technically not the United States. Now, whether or not, again, like you said, the United States chooses to recognize this is a different matter entirely. And as we've seen, companies like Kapochi Wallet have opted not to do business with any U.S. customers whatsoever, because even though they're not a U.S. company, the U.S. financial authorities assert that if you do business with any single U.S. customer, then de facto, all the same rules that apply to everyone who is a U.S. company also apply to you.
Exchanges and a vibrant Bitcoin economy on native reservations and stuff like that would do a lot. It's really interesting in the U.S. because there's these American Indian reservations. Some of them, they're doing pretty well. There's not much poverty. Some of them, there's like a lot of poverty, a lot of, unhealth, a lot of disease. It's frankly the places where the federal government has stepped in and done everything, wanted to manage everything about the lives of these people on top of taking their land originally. I think like having a Bitcoin economy there could really be a chance for economic revitalization, especially in some of these areas where they really need it.
Well, interestingly enough, over the history of the Indian reservations, even if the federal government doesn't particularly like it, the courts have actually recognized quite an extensive level of sovereignty in the reservations, including with regards to gaming, which has been established by the Supreme Court in several separate occasions, but also in issues of money lenders and money transmitters and other things like that. Far more than a currency within the reservation, I think it would be much more interesting to think of the reservation as a sovereign legal environment for establishing exchanges, for establishing payment suppliers and things like that within the U.S.
Do you think that would get around FinCEN asserting authority? Because, it seems like, you can treat it like a different country, but it's still...
Well, keep in mind, it's not just FinCEN, right? So you've got all these overlapping jurisdictions, and I don't think FinCEN has been the main problem, or the federal government necessarily. The states have been. Whether you get out of the federal government jurisdictions, yes, you do partly, but not entirely. So there are some things, there's a lot of overlap. But Indian reservations are subject to some state regulations, not all state regulations in the states they reside. So again, it's a patchwork of laws, and certainly they have some sovereignty more so than the county next door that's not an Indian reservation. I think it's worth a court case, and that's really the only way you find out. Start one, let them sue, don't let them shut you down.
I'm kind of excited about that idea. I wonder if it's already been started. I wonder if somebody's already kind of doing this.
Well, if casinos were a good idea for American Indians and were able to generate revenues for the reservations, I think Bitcoin exchanges could effectively do the same thing, but with a much more global audience and with much less reliance on geographic borders. This should be great. It's another way to take advantage of what little American Indians got back from the U.S. government.
That's a really interesting point, that it's about the global audience relative to gambling, where it's more about people coming in. Because I talked about this with Jeffrey Tucker the last time we spoke, about this idea that a country like, say, Greece or Cyprus could choose to effectively opt out of the monetary system and use Bitcoin to, instead of being in their local or their regional, with the euro, they could instead be in the global system, which is, of course, the Bitcoin or the cryptocurrency system. So, it seems like the same thing could very much apply here with these little sovereign nations, and each one of them not only can connect to each other through this as a means of doing easy business, from reservation to reservation, but also to interact with the entire world, basically, which is very exciting.
Which is, in fact, how money used to work. The idea that you have a single source of money is ridiculous. And in fact, over the history of money, all of these sovereign environments, and in fact, much smaller units of organization down to city-states and even individual families, were issuing currency and backing that currency in a healthy market of currencies. Now it's down to sovereign states, and even those kind of not really. So I think it's a much more healthy return to how money should work in a much more free economy.
We don't have any direct experience with this, but if any of our listeners out there are part of a reservation or have an opinion on this that comes from a different perspective, absolutely write in, Adam at letstalkbitcoin.com, or go to the Let's Talk Bitcoin subreddit at letstalkbitcoin.com/talk.
I just wonder if there's a Native American reservation that has has like a Bitcoin exchange or some kind of Bitcoin gaming operation there or whatever, and they start to do really well with it, is the federal government going to see that and think, oh, we need to get our hands on that? Or like the state governments, just like the lottery or even casinos, where they want like state-run casino in some places to generate revenue for the state. Like if it gets too successful, I'm wondering if governments are just going to be like, ooh, we want a piece of that in some way.
Nothing different about that. I mean, I think it's just commerce like any other, I mean, it's just
yeah,
the rules of the road.
Could you guys imagine like a state-run Bitcoin exchange? That would be like going to the DMV to go get some Bitcoins or something. I just have trouble imagining that.
Things used to be simple. Bitcoin wasn't taken seriously, so important companies like BitInstant were founded on a whim, the faintest scent of capital able to catalyze their startup operations for months. But things are different now, and as we move towards regulatory and governmental legitimacy, the barrier to entry for new people rises along with the cost of compliance. The Bitcoin Foundation is an organization on the razor's edge, pushing for legitimacy through education, yet trying to protect the nascent financial industry from the crushing burdens that come along with it. After meeting with an alphabet soup of regulators and legislators in DC earlier this week, Bitcoin NYC founder and LTB New York correspondent Jonathan Mohan caught up with Marco Santori, chair of the Foundation's Regulatory Affairs Committee and one of the primaries pushing towards a more nuanced understanding of Bitcoin at the government level. We join them now.
So, Marco, thank you for sitting down and talking with us. I know that you're a lawyer, but what is your involvement with the Bitcoin Foundation?
Right, I'm a lawyer in private practice here in New York City. I represent early-stage technology companies, more and more in the digital currency industry, and Bitcoin in particular. As to the foundation, I'm the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation's Regulatory Affairs Committee, which means my committee, we interface with state and federal regulators on the topic of digital currency regulation. We try to, at least now, our focus is on education and closing the knowledge gap and making sure that state regulators and federal regulators understand the Bitcoin industry, the businesses in it, the users in it, what it has been, what it is, and what it might be, since realistically, none of us really know for sure.
This Monday, you and about 4 other representatives from the Bitcoin Foundation took to Washington to speak with federal regulators about Bitcoin. How did that meeting even come about?
It was FinCEN's conference. It was FinCEN's meeting, they called it, and they invited the Bitcoin Foundation. They also invited all of the other agencies, regulators, and enforcement agencies that were there. They managed to get really a lot of the biggest stakeholders in Washington in the same room. So kudos and hats off to them for doing so.
There were a lot of scary 3-letter named organizations there. Who were the agencies that were represented at the conference, and how well were they represented?
There were a ton of agencies there. And yeah, like you said, it's something of an alphabet soup when you list them all off, but I can try to get most of them if I don't get all of them. Well, obviously FinCEN had hosted it, so FinCEN was there. IRS was there, FDIC, Federal Reserve, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, FBI, DEA, Secret Service, and the Department of Homeland Security was there as well.
So there were quite a number of enforcement agencies. What was their take on it?
As you might guess, the regulators and the enforcers each had different takes on Bitcoin, and they viewed Bitcoin through their own lenses. The regulators, they were more interested in the policy positions of what the consequences are of regulating Bitcoin in a certain way, whereas the investigative folks were interested in the nitty-gritty creative methodologies to find bad actors, to accomplish interdiction, and just general investigative tricks and tips that they could use to do their investigative jobs. And one of the representatives from the foundation who was there with me, Brian Klein, is actually an ex-federal prosecutor and was able to explain how, say, using the blockchain, for example, makes investigation of a Bitcoin transaction possible, and makes it possible in ways that investigating a cash transaction really would never be possible.
So would you say that there was more excitement or fear in the room?
It depends on who was asking the questions. So just to sort of recap the structure of it, there was about an hour's worth of presentation from each of the representatives from the foundation. And then we did about an hour of answering questions. Some of the questions were hard questions. And sometimes we had to give hard answers about what about Bitcoin is simply not going to change. What about Bitcoin might be changed in the future based on the community's interest in doing so. So some of the investigators, like I said, were interested in hearing more about enforcement methodologies. And the regulators wanted to know more about why, for example, somebody might want 10,000 different Bitcoin addresses if it wasn't to launder money. The investigators wanted to know what they would be able to do to follow a transaction from point A to point B, to really follow the money. Because if you know how criminal financial investigations work, typically they know who they're trying to get, the investigators. What the challenge is discovering what happened with the money, who took the money to whom, at what time, and what amounts, and that sort of thing. So I have to say, it was more interest than anything. I didn't get a lot of fear from people. I think that it was really encouraging, actually, to hear them asking intelligent and informed questions and not just giving sort of knee-jerk reactions that I think a lot of people feared we were going to get.
You know, the following day, you spent almost the entire day talking to congressmen about Bitcoin. What was that experience like? How many did you end up talking to, and what were their concerns and their fears?
You know, that's a good question. When you run through it in one day and try to look back on it, all the conversations are distinct, and everybody asks different kinds of questions and has different kinds of concerns. So when we were meeting with representatives from conservative politicians' offices, conservative legislators' offices, we would have one set of concerns. And when we were meeting with more liberal legislators, we'd have another set of concerns. And we'd have to respond to each of them and truthfully just sort of explaining what about the Bitcoin protocol is good and what's potentially bad for them. We really had a frank conversation, and I was surprised really to see the difference in levels of understanding and levels of concern. Some offices really weren't all that interested in Bitcoin. To the other side of the spectrum, some of them were really concerned about what was going on. Some of them were very informed about Bitcoin, and some of them, there was a knowledge gap that we needed to close.
What was one of the toughest questions that one of the congressmen asked? Like, just sort of kind of understanding from a fly on the wall what that conversation looked like.
I think that they were all, they all seemed to be concerned about money laundering. One of the more interesting concerns that I think is probably apropos is consumer privacy concerns. And they wanted to know about use cases. They wanted to know about examples of how Bitcoin supposedly puts privacy back into the hands of consumers. And what are the consequences of that? What are the good ones and what are the bad ones?
There's this vibe in the community that the government just wants to learn about Bitcoin, not to get it regulated, but to kill it as quickly as possible. When you were there, what was the feeling that you got from them? Was it that they're genuinely working together to get it regulated? Or do you think that there is just so much of a lack of understanding of Bitcoin, or maybe just a misunderstanding of how it can be used and a fear that it might be used to illicit means, that they may just want to kill Bitcoin entirely?
First of all, I don't think that anybody that we spoke with had any intention or desire to kill Bitcoin or to eliminate it, that at least they expressed to us. One of the positions that the foundation was very firm on, and it was sort of where we had our pivot foot down, really our first moving proposition, is that people have figured out how to use the internet to send money, and there's no changing that. There's no stopping it. The question is, how do we address it? What do we do from here? And that was our first premise. It's not something that anybody really seemed to question. I think that people understood intuitively that this is a real substantial development in the course of human affairs. I don't think anybody expressed any real interest in killing it or stifling it. What they wanted to know was, now what do we do?
I know you lead the Regulatory Affairs Committee. To a person listening to this talk who wants to get involved and help this community move forward as it relates to regulation, how could they contact you? How could they help?
Well, everybody that we've spoken to so far in Washington with follow-up comments and within the foundation, I think the general consensus is that this was just a tremendous, tremendous success for all involved. For those who want to get more involved, the first step is to look into joining the foundation. If you're interested in having a voice in the course of Bitcoin affairs generally, and specifically in these sorts of meetings, the best way to do that is to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Marco. Keep up what you're doing.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly show include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors at letstalkbitcoin.com.
More than 300,000 users and counting trust blockchain.info. It's a Bitcoin wallet service and a wealth of Bitcoin information, and it's completely free to use. With a blockchain.info wallet, you'll get the convenience of a web wallet and the security of a desktop client. Blockchain.info is also a block explorer. You can use it to see Bitcoin transactions in real time, check the balance of any Bitcoin address, and view many handy Bitcoin charts, all for free. See what they have to offer today at blockchain.info. We received a listener email about something that happened at this point not too recently, maybe about a month ago, but I think it's pretty much evergreen because it highlights an issue that could potentially affect all different kinds of coins, including Bitcoin. So this listener wrote in about a Terracoin attack that happened recently, and it's been referred to as a 51% attack and also as a time warp attack. Apparently what happened is somebody pointed some powerful source of hashing power at the Terracoin network. And Terracoin, by the way, is an altcoin. The thing that's, I guess, different or unique about Terracoin is that it has a very short block generation time, and the difficulty also adjusts very, very quickly. Terracoin would be a great example of a coin that might be prone to this thing that Andreas described as being underwater on your difficulty, right? Where the difficulty could go really high, and then someone could pull out a very powerful miner, and then you could end up with a difficulty that's high and not enough hashing power to match it, and then you can't find a block suddenly for a very long time. Terracoin has these characteristics, and apparently what happened is since it's an altcoin, it's got kind of a smaller network. Somebody points a powerful ASIC at the Terracoin network, generates their own blockchain. On this blockchain, apparently they also did something so that the difficulty was a lot lower so that coins could be mined a lot easier. I'm not exactly sure how they did that, but that's the time warp part of the attack. Then they created a bunch of Terracoins, or they mined a bunch of Terracoins on their own alternate blockchain. And then they took them to an exchange, sold them on the exchange, traded them for different coins, withdrew the other coins, and then vanished. And so what they had was basically they mined all these Terracoins on an alternate Terracoin blockchain, sold them, and then disappeared. And since that wasn't the real blockchain, those coins never existed, but they got the coins that they exchanged them for. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Sounds like exactly the kind of attack you can pull off if you can persuade nodes. And in this particular case, it sounds like the node they persuaded was the exchange, that was the consensus blockchain. So the exchange had to be at some point persuaded that the consensus blockchain for Terracoin was the one in which this particular miner had outputs to spend. And so they persuaded the exchange to be on the wrong blockchain. That's the danger of running these services, especially if you are an outlet, an off-ramp from the Bitcoin or altcoin economy. Unless you're absolutely sure that the value is there to spend, and you can source that information independently from multiple peers or verify it to make sure you're on the right blockchain. If you give that value out, you're the double spendee.
So this is a small exchange that basically got screwed in this transaction. Unfortunately, it was BTerra, I think, was the name of the exchange. Do you think that this is Obviously, if a coin has more network hashing power on its network, the less likely an attack like this is to happen. And probably this is partly the fault of Terracoin being a small altcoin and a newer kind of coin, and also mining on SHA-256, where somebody can basically take current existing technology, which is like a powerful ASIC, and use it to take a lot of the Terracoin network power and do something malicious with it. But do you guys think other coins are vulnerable to this too? Like, could somebody do this with a script coin? Could somebody do this with Bitcoin? It would be a lot harder, but what can we learn from this lesson?
For a point of reference, and this is a really interesting page that has been created by Jeff Garzik, who's one of the developers of Bitcoin. This is the Bitcoin Robustness Index, BRIX. And what Jeff has done here is built a site where you can see the estimated cost of a 51% attack against Bitcoin as of today. And so today, in order to do a 51% attack against Bitcoin, it would take $400 million. As a point of comparison, that is higher than the defense budgets of 92 countries.
Yes, I love that because it compared it to the military spending of all these different countries.
So 400 million is what it would take to even attempt to launch such an attack on Bitcoin. And then even if you were able to do that, you'd have to find an exchange that was persuaded that your blockchain was a valid blockchain and wasn't sufficiently well connected to notice that you were doing a 51% attack. You know, keep in mind, Terracoin Exchange at some point was getting either only one blockchain or it was getting multiple blockchains reported to it while connected to the Terracoin network. So, you know, there's a number of different ways that these types of attacks occur. It's not just getting the hashing power. You also have to then persuade someone that you have the right blockchain.
I'm trying to figure out how something like this can be avoided, because it sounds like this exchange didn't necessarily do anything wrong. It sounds like this is more something just having to do with essentially the network being taken over for a short amount of time as far as the exchange was concerned. So, I mean, do we know if they were not waiting for many confirmations, or did the confirmations just not matter? Because, I mean, this is a question, you know, people talk about Litecoin or altcoins that reduce the block time for confirmations and say that that makes it so that you have faster confirmations. But my understanding is that that isn't necessarily true. You do get faster confirmations, but the confirmations are less valuable.
So let's first explain what a confirmation is, because I think there's a bit of misunderstanding around that.
Please.
There is no such thing as a message that says, hey, confirmed, you're confirmed. There's no confirmation message per se. What a confirmation is that another block has been mined on top of the one your transaction is in. It means you're buried under another block. That's one confirmation. If you've got two confirmations, it means your transaction is buried under 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 4 blocks, 5 blocks. If there's 6 blocks mined on top of your transactions, for someone to fake or double spend that, they would have had to be able to mine a 6-block fork. Now, it sounds like, in this case of Terracoin, if the exchange assumed those confirmations were valid, then that scammer had managed to mine an alt chain or forked chain with enough blocks to be more than the number of confirmations, which then persuaded the exchange that this was a valid transaction. Now, in Bitcoin, in order to get 6 blocks ahead, you'd have to have more than 51% of the hashing power and maintain that for 6 blocks. In order to do a double spend. $400 million.
That is roughly 60 minutes under under ideal circumstances in the Bitcoin network. But in the Terracoin network, because it looks like they do blocks every 2 minutes, 120 seconds, for 6 confirmations there, it's only 12 minutes. So is it the time?
Is it 6 confirmations though? So 6 confirmations is by convention on the Bitcoin network. You can, as a vendor or as a merchant or as an exchange, if you want, you can say, I want 12. I want 8, whatever. How many are the norm on Terracoin? Do we know?
No, we don't know. But I think that this is the point, though, is that you would want more confirmations in a situation where confirmations are less valuable by themselves because they happen more often, right?
Right. So there's not much of a point of having faster ones, right? Because you just need more to make up for the security.
Depends on the difficulty. Essentially, each confirmation is a validation that someone did that level of difficulty to prove the work. Right? So if the difficulty is low, your confirmation isn't worth much because it's not that hard to create one.
which is a problem that altcoins have because they always have that chicken egg problem where they show up and nobody's using them, so they have to bootstrap an audience, which means that they have a small audience, which means that it's easier to do these things. And since these things can happen, it makes, I mean, like you can see there's a circular logic here that if you get targeted as an altcoin early on and you're poorly positioned to be able to handle this type of thing, this can be really disruptive. And it seems like, just in a nutshell, that's what happened with TerraCoin.
That's what happened with TerraCoin again.
Yeah, I was just going to say this isn't the first time it's happened to them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yes. They've had 51% attacks before, and they've also had the difficulty problem too, where they got too high in the difficulty. Some miners then dropped out, and then it was impossible to get the next block. It's been a big problem, and it hasn't just affected TerraCoin either. This has kind of happened to a lot of different altcoins. Feathercoin's had a couple of attacks, 51% attacks. Litecoin's had spam attacks, probably 51% attacks too. It's kind of a growing pain, I guess, but some coins are just not going to cut it. You know, they're just not designed to withstand any potential pressures that are sort of in the environment of users, some of whom might be malicious. And maybe TerraCoin is one of those, you know, just because of the way it's designed.
There's two conclusions you can reach from this. The first conclusion is that when you take the core parameters of Bitcoin and you tweak them to make an altcoin, it's not guaranteed that you're going to come up with a correct set or a healthy set of parameters. It certainly sounds like TerraCoin has found itself in an area of parameters that causes difficulty whiplash, let's put it that way, or very big swings in difficulty, possibility 51% attack. So one conclusion is Satoshi Nakamoto got these parameters more or less right on the first try. That's pretty impressive. And we've seen that because the other altcoins aren't doing much better in terms of the core parameters. The second conclusion I would draw from this is it's hard to boot a currency because in the early stages it's very, very vulnerable to malicious effects, which means that the network of Bitcoin and its resilience to altcoins is higher than we anticipated. It's going to be harder for competitors to jumpstart and bootstrap into this environment.
Can an altcoin that comes out now be viable if it uses SHA-256? If it shares the same hashing algorithm, the same way that it does mining as Bitcoin does, then that means that as the Bitcoin network increases over time, and as miners who have hardware that's really, really, really efficient by any meaningful standard, but compared to the amount that's being thrown at the Bitcoin network is not significant at all, do you see where I'm going with this? It seems like there's an inherent problem here where if you use that same algorithm and someone can turn a single unit that's going to devote 400 gigahash worth of power into your network, and your network is small, that can blow up your currency just from a single miner devoting a single unit. But that could also be a good thing if lots of people do it, right?
It reminds me of the red ocean, blue ocean strategy concept, which was a management book written in the past, which was quite popular. The idea being that as an entrepreneur, as a business, you don't want to go into an ocean that's already full of sharks and red with blood. You want to find a chunk of the ocean that's blue, right? That doesn't have too many predators in it. Well, in this case, choosing SHA-256 as the proof of work puts you right in the shark pool. So maybe if you're a guppy, you don't want to be there. Maybe you want to see if you can use the proof of work to carve out your own little swimming pool where you can survive for long enough to play with the big boys. Otherwise, the ASICs will come and swallow you.
We talk a lot about altcoins, and we talk a lot about coins that basically take the Bitcoin protocol and fork it, making a couple of changes and going in their own direction with hopes that they'll catch traction based on the merits that they've introduced. This morning we're joined by J.R. Willett. He's developed a protocol, or I don't even know really what you'd call it. It's almost like a metacoin. It's not an altcoin in a conventional sense because it rides on top of the Bitcoin network, but it makes some things possible that are pretty interesting. So again, I'm really glad to be joined by JR this morning to tell us a little bit about what Mastercoin is and why it's something that should matter to us.
Hey, Adam. Thanks for having me on your show. I love listening to your podcast. I think you're doing an awesome job. Mastercoin, I came up with the basics of this 2011. I mean, I've been percolating on it for a long time. And the one sentence summary is we're building a protocol layer on top of Bitcoin. So you can think of Bitcoin as money, and you can also think of it as a protocol layer. If you think of it as a protocol layer, then you can put another protocol layer on top of it. Doing so lets you create a new coin, so to speak, that does everything Bitcoin does and adds some new features. Features we could add are pretty much unlimited. Right off the gate, we're hoping to do kind of a distributed exchange between Bitcoin and these new currencies being built on top of Bitcoin. I call the first layer Mastercoin, and then the idea is that people can build their own currencies on top of that without doing any programming.
Let's back up for a second here. When we talk about a layer being built on top of Bitcoin or a protocol that's built on top of the Bitcoin protocol, are there any analogs in other areas that people might be familiar with of what this sort of thing looks like, or is this something that's entirely new?
Well, I like to compare it to HTTP. Anytime you type in a web address, it starts with HTTP. That's a protocol layer, and it runs on top of TCP/IP. Everybody listening to this podcast will know what an IP address is. TCP/IP is a protocol layer, and HTTP runs right on top of it and uses it to accomplish what it wants to do.
But TCP/IP came first. I mean, this is important. Is that TCP/IP was an underlying technology that was neutral and that allowed for further protocol layers like HTTP to be added on top of it that make it more useful in different ways that maybe TCP/IP wasn't. Is that right?
Exactly.
So what you're doing here is very similar to that, because you're taking the Bitcoin protocol, which is neutral, and you're building a layer on top of it. And you said that this layer then will allow for additional layers to be built on top of it?
Yeah, that's the idea. I'm trying to, open the ecosystem up. Everybody has a crazy idea of what they want to see Bitcoin do, and I want to provide some tools to let people do that.
One of the complaints that's been sort of levied against this idea that everybody has something different that they want Bitcoin to do is that you're putting too many things into Bitcoin. You're making the core protocol too complicated. So it sounds like this is kind of the response to that, is that, okay, well, we won't add to the protocol. We'll just build another protocol on top that people can opt into.
And that's exactly right. And it's important to keep the core Bitcoin protocol stable. You add some new feature to that and break it, and that's a very big deal. And Gavin does a fantastic job of being very conservative of what new features are being added to Bitcoin. But when you start building on top of Bitcoin, you can be a little bit more experimental. And as you said, it's opt-in.
What is it that Mastercoin is adding? What are like the top three things, if there are three things and not just one thing, that Mastercoin is bringing to the table that are not possible with Bitcoin, but that are possible with this additional layer?
Well, I mentioned the distributed exchange. To my knowledge, nobody's ever done a distributed exchange between two cryptocurrencies. The reason we can do that is because it's all on the Bitcoin blockchain. The next thing after that's going to be distributed betting. So basically, you'll be having, person A will be publishing some data into the blockchain at a very low rate. And I'm worried about blockchain bloat. That's probably the biggest criticism of this project, is that it adds a lot to the Bitcoin blockchain. But so something like once a day, adding, the price of gold, for instance, to the Bitcoin blockchain. And then everybody in the world can bet on it using this protocol. So, I could bet that gold's going to go up. You could bet that gold is going to go down. And the whole protocol recognizes the winner of that bet. And we don't have to go off to Bets of Bitcoin or, one of however many Bitcoin betting sites there are now. We can just use math and protocol and not have to trust a human being to hold our money. Now, we do have to trust the data source. If the data source gets compromised, then obviously our bet would go south.
And so a data source in this context would be something like a RSS feed that would be essentially feeding data at a fixed rate into the blockchain, and then everybody else is basically just watching that, and the people who have bet one side and people who have bet the other side, really, even though they don't know each other, they've bet against each other as far as the blockchain is concerned, and so the blockchain just kind of works it out?
Yeah, and everybody parsing Mastercoin transactions pays attention to those bets and pays attention to who wins, and then recognizes the winner as the owner of the coins that were at stake. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's going to be a big feature. I think the feature that I'm most excited about is user currencies which track external values. So, if we already have the price of gold being published into the blockchain, I have a a scheme to set up user currencies which will track the value of gold. So, you could have a gold coin and own it and have it track the price of an ounce of gold. And there's a lot of argument about, how well that will work. I think it will, and we'll see.
Well, the big question whenever we start talking about redeemable cryptocurrencies is, are they actually redeemable? Because it seems like in order for something like that to be pegged, you have to either be able to put up a whole bunch of collateral in case the price goes way up or the price goes way down. It seems like there's risk there that is difficult to ameliorate unless at some point in the chain I'm able to say, okay, well, this is my gold coin. It entitles me to 1 gram of gold, and I'd like to cash this in and have somebody send me that 1 gram of gold. Can I do that?
The way people have typically approached this problem is the colored coin approach, where you have an issuer, and you sort of have this guy that stores some gold in a warehouse somewhere and sells shares of it for people to trade, and then everybody has to trust the issuer to honor those shares. What I'm attempting to accomplish is a trustless backing using an escrow fund. So you're exactly right. You have to have something of value stored to back this up. And essentially everybody buying into a new currency like this is putting their money into an escrow fund, which is then used to peg the value of that currency to the data feed.
So does that work?
There's an awful lot of argument about that. It's never been tried before, but I believe it will.
Okay, fair enough. So you can do the distributed betting, you can do the pegging currencies to things that are data feeds of prices going into the blockchain. Where are you right now with this project? Is it still in the conceptual stages? Is it already out? I mean, what's the time frame on this, roughly speaking?
Well, I've published the complete specification of the features we've talked about so far. So, if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, somebody else could implement it from what I've written. It's down to the byte level of, what the messages look like. Mastercoin and everything based on it is 100% message based. That's an important point. Colored coins, you anoint a certain number of Satoshis as, having some special meaning, and then you trade them around. Mastercoins is different. Mastercoins is only messages. So if I want to send you Mastercoins, I have to publish a message in a certain format into the blockchain that says, I transfer 5 Mastercoins to, Adam's Bitcoin address, and I have to have the message in the right format. And if I do, everyone will recognize that transfer. But I can use any Bitcoins to publish that message. It doesn't matter which Bitcoins I use.
I was under the impression that Bitcoin itself did not have a messaging protocol and that there was no real memo field, and that was something that users see locally. They have the ability to locally make labels or notes. So how are you putting information into the blockchain?
That is a fantastic question. There are other people doing similar things, and what it essentially involves is destroying a small amount of Bitcoins in order to accomplish this. So basically, I create a fake Bitcoin address. So it starts with 1, and it has a payload of 20 bytes, and I can put anything I want in those 20 bytes, and then there has to be a checksum at the end that makes it a valid Bitcoin address. And then I send us, the protocol involves sending a small amount of Bitcoins, just above the dust threshold, which is currently about half a cent, to that fake address. So those Bitcoins are destroyed, about half a cent worth of Bitcoins are destroyed. They'll never be spendable. But we've just put 20 bytes of arbitrary data into the blockchain.
If Mastercoin is successful to the level that you would like it to be, is that sustainable over the long term? Are there literally enough Bitcoins that this is something that could operate for 100 years without it actually causing a problem?
Well, it depends on how you define causing a problem. We're not going to run out of Bitcoin. The dust threshold will shrink if Bitcoins become more valuable. We've got, 8 decimal places, and we could have even more if we wanted them. So I'm not worried about running out of Bitcoins. The legitimate concern is blockchain bloat. Now, Mastercoin is designed, hopefully, to be as compact as possible, but we're still adding a lot of transactions to the blockchain. If we're wildly successful, I like to say that Satoshi Dice will look pretty tame in comparison.
And you're saying Satoshi Dice will look tame in comparison because they do basically the same thing. They destroy very small amounts of Bitcoin in order to generate essentially their betting results. Is that right?
I don't know if they destroy any Bitcoins, but They get a lot of flack because they just have so many transactions.
I see.
Now, Mastercoin, Mastercoin is essentially making Bitcoin more useful. If Bitcoin becomes more useful, there will be more transactions. If there's more transactions, the blockchain will get larger at an even faster rate, which will cause even greater migraines for all the Bitcoin developers, and they may cuss me. So that's kind of the bad side of this.
I see. So now, one of the most common ways, and this is actually the primary way that I've seen, that people introduce new coins into existence is that they make them mineable. But that's actually not true with Mastercoin. Mastercoin has a different scheme.
Because we've already got Bitcoin mining away, Satoshi did us a great favor in solving the which came first problem, which is the root of double spending. So we don't need to solve the double spending problem because we're writing on top of Bitcoin. It already solves that problem, so we don't really need mining. So I structured Mastercoin as a Kickstarter. So essentially anybody who sends funds to a certain address before a certain date, owns some Mastercoins, and then as we build the protocol, those will hopefully become more valuable.
Then this is a currency that literally you can't mine into, but you can buy into if you have Bitcoin.
Yeah. I created an address called the Exodus address, and I was basing that off the idea of, Bitcoin started from the Genesis block, and so I said, well, Mastercoin starts from the Exodus address, and it starts with, one Exodus, and we've raised actually quite a bit of money there, and almost over. It actually is through the end of this month. This is August 2013, and we've only got, actually at the time this podcast will be published, only a couple days left.
That is true. So if people are interested in this, so this seems speculative. Even more so than Bitcoin seems speculative, this seems speculative. We didn't actually go over where you are on this. So you're collecting funds for it, and those funds are being used to generate the new Mastercoins, and the people who contribute money now will get the appropriate amount of Mastercoins. Is there a conversion rate?
We're doing 100 Mastercoins for every Bitcoin contributed to the Exodus address, and there's a kind of an early bird bonus of 10% a week. So when I first announced this whole thing about a month ago, people were getting a 40% bonus for buying in early, and obviously now it's down to pretty much 100 to 1. And yeah, you asked, where are we with the project? We've got to the point of being able to send them. I have a Python script that you can type in an address and say I want to send 5 Mastercoins to this Bitcoin address, and it will tell you what sends you have to send from your Bitcoin client to make that happen. And I've been using that for a giveaway thread. It's a fairly common thing that somebody starting a new currency will do these days, is you start a little giveaway thread. And so I bought some Mastercoins and I've been giving them away using that protocol. So we've been doing SIMs, and that's the simplest and most basic type of Mastercoin transaction.
For this to get to a position where you feel like the product is representative of the vision that we've been talking about here, what type of time frame is that? I don't want to pin you down to a date, but are we talking, is this a couple of months out, 6 months out, years out? Is there an estimate?
Yeah, it depends somewhat on how much money is raised. It's been picking up lately, so, it could be that there's a lot more money raised in the next few days. But, assuming that it doesn't go up a lot, I'm not planning on quitting my day job. So that's a whole nother conversation. But I have 3 small children, and, so that my time is limited to work on this myself. I'm hoping to do some bounties, leveraging other people's time in exchange for the money that's been raised. And it probably, if I raised obscene amounts of money and was able to, quit my job and work on this full time, I think we'd probably have the majority of these features maybe in kind of a ghetto form, command line type of programs running within a few weeks, and fancier GUI-based systems, web and so forth a few weeks later. I'm thinking that given that I'm not quitting my day job and, relying on other people, it may be double that with the fundraising we've done so far.
Okay, so it sounds like you're fairly confident that you'll have something workable by the end of the year? Is that safe to say?
We already have something workable, so
okay.
we already send Mastercoins.
I gotcha.
But it will definitely be more workable and usable by the end of the year. I'm not sure that we'll have every feature by then, but we should have some awfully nifty stuff by the turn of the year. So
now you mentioned that you weren't going to be quitting your job. Do you have a team that's going to be working on this, or is this a totally solo project right now? I know you mentioned bounties, but I mean as far as people who are going to be developing this as developers.
It's me right now. And it's whoever I recruit through whatever bounties I'm able to put out. And there are some people who are very interested in this project and have been giving me a lot of help, which is awesome.
JR, if somebody wants to either get involved with the project or learn more about it or possibly invest and get some Mastercoins for themselves, is there a website that they can go to, or are you guys just living on the Bitcoin forums these days?
Well, we are living on the Bitcoin forum so far. However, one of the guys on the forum registered Mastercoin.org, and it redirects to our project thread. If you type in Mastercoin.org, you'll get to the right place, and we're working on a bounty for the website.
So, JR, thank you very much for joining us today and talking to us about Mastercoin. I look forward to seeing how this project develops over time. It seems very exciting.
I'm excited about it.
Hi, Stephanie here. Would you like to turn your book into an enthralling audiobook? Need a persuasive commercial to promote your company? How about a narrator for your explainer video? Here's where I can help. I'm a freelance voiceover artist, and since 2009, I've lent my voice to dozens of audio projects. To hear some examples of my work, check out my website, smvoice.info. If you like what you hear, I'd love to be the voice of your next project. Get in touch at smvoice.info.
In addition to bringing you intelligent news, discussions, and interviews, Let's Talk Bitcoin is about testing new models. Despite our growing audience, listener support has been down, both in terms of cumulative numbers of tips and the actual amount of tippers. Way down. If you appreciate the work we're doing, the best way to show that support is to send us tips, shop with our sponsors, and of course, share the show with everyone who ought to be concerned with the future of money. Visit us at letstalkbitcoin.com, and thanks for listening.
Guys, my first Bitcoin was a physical Bitcoin, and it was one of the Casacious Bitcoins. Casacious is one of the first company to make physical representations of Bitcoins. It's basically a token that has some pretty graphics. It's gold colored, and on the back there's a private key or a code, I guess, that goes to Mt. Gox that you can put in and redeem your Bitcoins, and it's covered up by a hologram for security. It's basically a way to have physically represented Bitcoins. And so I have kind of a soft spot in my heart for those, I guess, because that was the first coin that I ever possessed or received. Now there's more physical Bitcoins starting to come out. People have made coins that are actually made out of silver or even gold that have Bitcoin private keys on them, and they're somehow encoded for security so that someone can't just look at the private key on the back and take the Bitcoins and run. And now there are even physical Litecoins coming out. There are some silver pieces that somebody has made, and they're, very beautiful graphics and have a Litecoin private key on the back. What's your opinion about physically represented coins? Because I could see how that might be a little confusing to a newbie. You tell them, wow, there's this great virtual currency and it's all online, it's frictionless, you can send it anywhere in the world, and oh, by the way, here's this chunk of metal that you can use to represent it.
It's a little confusing.
I could see how that would be kind of confusing, but on the other hand, I could see how it might also help somebody grasp the concept, right? Or help somebody feel more comfortable using it because it's something they can actually hold in their hand. Other talk around physical Bitcoins or other coins has centered around, is this a good way to do cold storage? Is this a good way to secure your coins offline? And is this a good way to use them anonymously? What do you guys think about that?
When I first got into Bitcoin, physical Bitcoins were absolutely the first thing that caught my attention, and the Casacious coin was definitely up there. It was also BitBills that I was interested in. Let's explain real briefly how these things work, because it is a confusing concept. And whenever you talk to people, I used to bring physical Bitcoins with me when I'd go someplace because it was an easy way to introduce it, but it also is the wrong way to introduce it because people don't understand the way that they work. What you're essentially doing with either a physical Bitcoin or a paper wallet or really any of these things is you're taking your wallet information, and instead of storing it on your computer, you're storing it on a physical object. And the hope is that it's stored there in a way that is secure so that it can have value loaded onto it through a public key that can then be verified through the public key. But so long as that private key is covered up, then nobody can spend it. So it means that you can easily verify the value within the token. And just by looking at it, you can see that it hasn't been tampered with, which means that it's still up for grabs. Really what this means, though, is that when you give someone a physical Bitcoin in person, you're not doing a Bitcoin transaction as the network usually does. Instead, what you're doing is you're literally giving them a wallet that contains a known amount of Bitcoin. So if you think about it, that's a really interesting thing. And it means that physical Bitcoins are the single most anonymous way to spend Bitcoins of anything, because so long as it's passing from hand to hand to hand, you can see this being used at conferences or something like that. There's no record of any of those transactions, in much the same way that if I hand you $1, there's no record of that transaction. If we were to make the transaction through the Bitcoin network, there would be a record. And so you'd be able to see them, but in a physical form, that's just not the case.
Another way of thinking about this, one of the main differences is the money we've been grown accustomed to over our lives has been physical money that's gradually been abstracted into the digital realm. From gold coins, intrinsic value abstracted, now it's more of an abstraction of the productive capacity of the country per se. But when you're dealing with digital money in our banking system, you're really representing the physical dollars of the treasury and the reserve banking capacity of the banks. Essentially, you're representing physical money in digital form. Bitcoin tokens are the exact opposite. You're taking digital frictionless money and you're representing it in physical form, and that creates some very interesting opportunities. The first one is that you're replacing all of the existing protocols of Bitcoin with physical equivalents. So securing your Bitcoins becomes a physical exercise. Transacting your Bitcoins becomes a physical exercise. You hand them over. Accounting for your Bitcoins is a physical exercise. You count them. You can visibly see how many there are. It really physicalizes not just the value, but all of the interactions, security features, and accounting features of Bitcoin. But it's still digital. So you can do some really interesting things. Like imagine if, let's say you had a physical Bitcoin that had some intelligence in it. You could have it locked to your own private security code based on proximity. So when you hand it to another person, a buyer, maybe your phone hands off the encryption keys to their phone as the physical token changes sides and unlocks it. So you could add extra layers of security or extra layers of intelligence because it is digital money, even though it's encoded in a physical token. So it's both weird, but it's also extremely exciting because it opens up new capabilities for Bitcoin that come from the physical realm, but also new capabilities for physical money that come from the Bitcoin realm, and creates a whole new category of money, which is this tokenized digital currency that we've never had before. And it has its very own characteristics.
It's the local global thing, I think, that's the most interesting about it. You can think about the digital version of Bitcoin as quite literally the global version where you can do business with anybody, anywhere, who's connected to the internet. And then these tokens are the localized format where they create some problems of their own, of course, because it's very hard to take a sealed physical Bitcoin and send it through the internet to someone. But you can make zero confirmation transactions because no transaction is actually happening. The one thing that people do tend to be concerned about with these, and I think that it's with good reason, and I'm not really sure what the solution is to this yet necessarily, is the problem of these are mostly made by individuals, and these are mostly made by very small companies because, again, the infrastructure hasn't really been there to require any sort of larger companies. Mike from Casatius still does all of his own, the sticker application by hand because there's sensitive information there. And if somebody were to get that and use it maliciously, then you could take the value off of it. And this is something that's really only a vulnerability at the beginning of the process when you're actually manufacturing them. But it's something that wouldn't necessarily show up until years, weeks, whatever point later that it makes sense to pull the value off of the coin. Looking at other areas of technology, Andreas, are there any solutions to that type of problem where you've got information that no human can know and yet it has to be applied during the manufacturing process?
That's a great question. Actually, Mike Caldwell himself has already solved this problem. The solution comes with a proposal he calls BIP 38, the Bitcoin Improvement Protocol 38, which allows for encryption of private keys. The simplest case, which we've actually implemented in the Safe Paper Wallet and Open Paper Wallet, is where you want on a paper wallet to encrypt a private key or in a Casatius coin with a PIN number or passphrase. So unless you know that second PIN number or passphrase, you can't unlock it. That's number one. What's not obvious from the specification is Mike has also proposed a multi-factor approach to this that involves splitting the private key in such a way that the manufacturer only knows part of the secret and can generate a coin, but that coin is useless unless it's paired with a private component that the buyer knows. And that actually essentially splits the key between manufacturer and buyer and guarantees that initial stage of the process when it's shipped.
That's very clever. That might be a good way to actually use physical Bitcoins for secure cold storage.
Absolutely. And I think BIP38 is going to become a critical component of that. I want to also push back on another concept, which is this idea that if you have a token, a physical token like that, it has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect to retain its value. And the reason I know this is because a very large percentage of the $20 bills that go through my hands are forged and counterfeit. And that applies also to a large percentage of the $20 bills that go through your hands. Yet we don't notice, and we also don't freak out about the value of our $20 bills, because if you have a system of enforcement where, every 100 transactions, that dollar bill goes through a merchant or retailer or banking teller who's going to use a magic pen to test it and take it out of circulation if it's counterfeit, you can make that the part of costs of doing business and essentially discounting the value by the amount of fraud that exists, which means you don't need 100% security. Sometimes you only need maybe 75% security. It establishes enough trust between consumer or buyer and seller that you don't need to do validity checks at every point. So I don't get a swipe of the UV pen on my $20 bill at every retail merchant. I don't get it at every checkout counter. But it happens often enough that the overall system is trusted. Let's discount this idea that you need 100% security. For physical circulation, you just need enough security that the majority of people can trust it for transactions.
But is that true for people who are looking at it for storage applications? Because I agree with you. It's not unusual for temporary or, event-specific token-based currencies to pop up. I mean, that's something that's happened forever. People don't generally save money in those. People generally use them, and then that's it. They lose their value once that particular event is done, or, they devalue. Something happens. But the point is that with Bitcoins, that's not necessarily true. And ideally, people wouldn't have to be cashing in their physical Bitcoins for the digital Bitcoins because of these concerns about security. And, I've had my coins at this point, I think, for about 2 years. So, isn't that a concern?
Is it a concern as to whether they still retain the value? I believe you could check.
Right, I could check. That's not what I mean. I mean, you're saying that it doesn't matter to you if a couple of counterfeit 20s go through your hands, because chances are pretty good that you're not going to be the one that feels the pinch when eventually they're pulled out of the system. Chances are pretty good. They're not staying in your hands. You're not keeping those counterfeit $20 bills, and you're not storing them in a bank where you're going to get those same $20 bills back. They're fungible.
It's a transactional currency. That's the fundamental difference, which is that if you use the physical Bitcoin tokens as a transactional currency, you don't care about forgery. If you use the physical Bitcoin tokens to store large amounts of Bitcoin in cold storage, I would totally recommend encryption and verifying the amounts are on there after you've encrypted it so that they stay on there. Absolutely. Which is where you'd apply something like BIP38.
Well, that's exciting. I didn't know that Mike was working on that, but that's really cool because that is a problem. I actually worked on a project called Bitcoin chips this was one of my first projects in the Bitcoin space. That was a real problem that we had, was trying to figure out ways where we could be able to manufacture these things without exposing it. So it's great to see that there's been work done on that. Thanks for listening to episode 37 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Content for today's show was provided by Stephanie Murphy, Andreas M. Antonopoulos, J.R. Willits, Jonathan Mohan, and Marco Santori. Music was provided by Jared Rubens, and we actually have a few new tracks in there that I kind of liked quite a bit. If you can't get enough original thought and discussion, read our daily blog at letstalkbitcoin.com, sign up for our weekly newsletter at theweeklybitcoin.com, and participate in our listener interaction area at letstalkbitcoin.com/talk. See you next time.